So the ICCPR essentially is a treaty that protects and preserves basic human rights, right to life, human dignity, equality before the law, freedom of speech, assembly and association, religious freedom, privacy, freedom from torture. It's a huge misconception that Pakistan is behind when it comes to technology. We saw how Pakistan was submitting complaint after complaint after complaint, asking them to suspend accounts, asking them to remove these posts, deleting accounts of human rights accounts of popular social justice movements, shutting down live videos, and very literally shutting down the internet, shutting down the network when gatherings happen. So it's a huge web, it's a huge khichdi of sorts, and a very intentional khichdi that the government has made and manufactured in order to one, portray a certain image on the international level that, we abide by all of these things, we do all of these things, we have all of these bodies, we're doing everything in a very efficient way, we respect human rights, etc., etc. And yet they were unable to answer a single specific question.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the DigiPod. My name is Farieha Aziz. Today I'm joined by Alifiyah Sohail, who is a human rights researcher. Today we're going to speak about the Human Rights Committee review of Pakistan and Pakistan's commitments under the ICCPR. Alifiyah, thanks for joining DawnNews English today. Could you just, before we get into the specifics of what was raised, especially with respect to digital rights before the committee, can you just contextualize for the audience what this committee is, the mandate, and Pakistan's commitments that were under review?
Thank you so much for having me, Farieha. So basically, the ICCPR is a treaty that obligates countries that have ratified it. So the ICCPR essentially is a treaty that protects and preserves basic human rights, right to life, human dignity, equality before the law, freedom of speech, assembly and association, religious freedom, privacy, freedom from torture. And in this is where our digital rights and civic rights also come in.
And what is the process that this committee follows? I believe that there were some society submissions as well made to the committee about a lot of the topics that you've just mentioned.
So basically what happens is that the United Nations Committee reaches out to the state and then also civil society organizations and human rights organizations within the country. They submit the list of issues that they will be bringing up during the committee, and then the delegation, and Pakistan's delegation actually this time submitted a written response before to the committee in response to some of the concerns that were going to be raised. And then in the committee, these concerns are raised, and the Pakistan delegation has a chance to respond in real time to all of the concerns that are being raised that they hadn't addressed in written form before.
So with respect to digital rights specifically, what were some of the questions or concerns that were raised by the committee?
So there were, in terms of Pakistan, actually, overall, this human rights session, there were 2 days that were taken to address the violations happening in Pakistan's human rights landscape. And the list was immense. And the importance of the digital rights in the way that they were brought up is how interconnected they are in terms of every other liberty that's also being violated, all the other rights that Pakistan has promised to preserve and says it is preserving that are being violated. And often, the modicum of violation and the source of violation now is the digital rights landscape and how it's being exploited to do all of these things. So one of the main concerns that came up right away was to do with defamation laws and how the defamation laws of this country are being used in a way where they're actually stifling freedom of expression. And then they basically moved on to the fact that defamation remains a criminal offense under the Pakistan Penal Code and the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act. And then they talked about the Punjab Defamation Bill 2024, which was passed without stakeholder consultation. This was a very important point that the United Nations brought up, because they said that it raises a lot of concerns because it talks about persecuting defamation with public officials, and Section 17 of the Act actually allows for fines without proof of actual damage, which sets a very, very dangerous precedent and is then being used as PEMRA and everything is being used as a tool for intimidation and repression, as opposed to ensuring freedom of speech and safe speech online. So essentially, the delegation asked the Pakistan government if there were any plans to review the defamation provisions to align with the state parties' obligations under the covenant. And they also asked them to clarify why the Punjab Defamation Bill was passed without adequate stakeholder consultations and how it's going to address all of these concerns, as well as focus on protecting not just public officials, but also, the general public and concerned citizens from allegations of defamation. We've seen how allegations of defamation are, before they even reach a court of law, you have, actions and people that take it upon themselves to impose the law themselves and impose justice, their kind of thing of justice themselves. So then the committee said that there are numerous reports that the United Nations has received in which PEMRA is exceeding its mandate and using directives as tools for censorship of journalists and media outlets and human rights defenders, suspending licenses for television channels, banning internet connections, and shutting down certain access to certain apps, and that has particularly increased over the past 6 months. So these were the main concerns that they brought up, and they said that the PEMRA Amendment Bill, which introduced definitions for misinformation and disinformation, would actually end up enabling further censorship under the guise of upholding authentic news. So this was one of the main concerns that the UN delegation, the Human Rights Committee, brought up to Pakistan during the session.
And I believe these, obviously, the submissions were made at the time when these laws were still bills, which have since then been enacted. So the Punjab Defamation Law has been enacted, as well as the PEMRA, amendments on the whole disinformation, were actually fake news, as they call it. Well, so internet disruptions in the firewall was also brought up by the committee towards the end, and the fact that, I mean, the government or the Pakistan delegation was asked about the impact on free expression and privacy. Was there a satisfactory response to that?
Well, actually, so they were very, very specific. This is something this time the UN Human Rights Committee, even though a lot of these laws were, enacted recently and a lot of these things were happening recently, the committee was very much up to date with recent developments that have taken place in Pakistan with regards to human rights violations, not just in the digital landscape, but also in terms of how human rights defenders have been attacked, how peaceful assembly has been attacked, and again, the importance of preserving digital rights through all of these things. So very specifically, the committee asked the Pakistan's delegation, internet censorship, frequent outage, blockages of social media apps, and slower connectivity are raising serious concerns about information control. They cited the May 2023 protests. They said that there were 4-day internet blackouts and social media shutdowns, followed by frequent outages and restrictions continuing in the general elections, which prevented voters from accessing polling information and limiting communication. So they very specifically asked the Pakistani delegation to explain how such internet shutdowns and social media blackouts align with its obligations under the cabinet, and what measures is Pakistan taking to ensure the necessity, proportionality, and legality of restrictions on freedom of expression. They also asked Pakistan if there's any plans to establish an independent oversight body to review and monitor internet censorship and throttling decisions to ensure transparency, accountability, and adherence to international human rights standards. They said, we look forward to your response very, very much. And by the time the Pakistani delegation responded, they essentially rehashed and reiterated what they had already submitted in written form prior to this session taking place. And this was, again, not just in regards to digital rights, it was in regards to all the other issues that were also brought up. For example, the misuse of the ECL and PCL and all of these things. So after the Pakistani delegation responded, it essentially read out the statement that it had already submitted. Quite a short statement where it just said, look, we've got freedom of press, we've got the Official Secrets Amendment Act. It doesn't target journalists or media organizations. In fact, the main objective is to safeguard confidential data on national security and defense matters, and that the PEMRA amendment was not approved without stakeholders. It was done in consultation with the media community, and the entire aim was to safeguard the rights of media workers. Then it said that we need to reiterate the legal protection afforded to journalists under the Right to Information Act, the PEMRA Ordinance, and the Protection of Journalists and Media Professional Acts of 2021. So it reread these things. It did not directly answer or address any of the specific instances that the United Nations brought up with regards to when the internet shutdowns happened, when social media apps were blocked, when, during peaceful assembly, network outages happened, whether that was during the Baloch-Raji Muchi, whether it was a Jirga that happened 2 weeks ago. None of these specific incidents were referred to in Pakistan's reply. And the UN delegation pointed that out. They said that, we're short on time. And as much as we appreciate Pakistan's response, it has not gone into any detail and provided any substantial answers to actually rectify or clarify the committee's concerns. Again, not just in regards to digital rights violations, but all the human rights violations that were brought up. The Pakistani delegation just reread the statements it had submitted prior to the commission's hearing.
Finally, Alifiyah, I think that this is a connection to Joe, right? When we're talking about digital rights, it's obviously not in a vacuum. And we recognize that they are connected to our civil and political rights under which this framework exists, and this review was being conducted as well. How do you see the relevance of whether it's connectivity, access to platforms, and laws such as Speak Out, the defamation law, etc., and their bearing on critical human rights advocacy that is taking place in the online spaces?
Well, Farieha, it's exactly as you said. These things don't exist in a vacuum, especially not in Pakistan. And I think that's quite deliberate. There's a web of mechanisms that exist to stifle dissent. And obviously, with the growth of technology and internet penetration in the country, that's one of the main tools. Now, in terms of censorship and stifling dissent and suppressing, popular voices, raising dissent and opposition, this has been ongoing in Pakistan, in every regime that has ruled Pakistan. In terms of the digital space, now they've found, figured out a way to use that also to suppress dissent and everything. Now, the issue is that where digital rights come in and where internet censorship is so important is that, for example, you're seeing how the internet and digital space is being exploited to silence voices, not just of journalists and activists. It's also coming out of popular movements, students, everywhere. We're seeing it everywhere. So whether that's, for example, some of the leaders of the Baloch-Raji Muchi were accused of defamation, of blasphemy, and these accusations were perpetrated mainly online. Now, we know the dangers of perpetuating false blasphemy charges against people online. We've seen what happens in Pakistan when false blasphemy charges are planted around. So at the end of the day, what Pakistan is doing is that it is using and combining every single modicum it has and every single modality of repression that it has and intertwining it into everything. When they saw that popular struggles and popular movements were resorting to social media, when peaceful assembly that was being done on the streets and sit-ins and roads and protests, when they were being oppressed, so people took to the digital space to voice their concerns. We saw how Pakistan would, Twitter, whether it was through X, whether it was through Facebook, whether it was through Instagram, we saw how Pakistan was submitting complaint after complaint after complaint, asking them to suspend accounts, asking them to remove these posts, deleting accounts of human rights accounts, of popular social justice movements, shutting down live videos, and very literally shutting down the internet, shutting down the network when gatherings happen. It's a huge misconception that Pakistan is behind when it comes to technology. I think that is a misconception that the government often uses to its advantage because it doesn't allude to the actual power they wield to censor and filter content. It's absolutely crazy that certain content will never reach you based on where you're living. It could have 4 million, 5 million, 6 million likes on platforms like TikTok, but it would never reach you if you're residing in, for example, urban areas of Karachi. We're seeing this everywhere. It's a very sophisticated stifling of content and suppression of voices. So the digital landscape is something that Pakistan is taking very, very seriously because we're seeing how the digital landscape is also promoting these human rights movements, how it's talking about the violations that are taking place. It's unearthing and it's combating and it's interrogating the narratives that, whether it's mainstream media is propagating it or whether it's our politicians that are propagating it. Social media has become an avenue of essentially showing the mirror and showing the reality, whether it's photography, whether it's videos, whether it's testimonies. We're seeing all of this happen in real time. And even when it happens in real time, even when we see footage of things happening, for example, assaults on peaceful protests, you'll see the next day them denying that this ever took place. So it's happening on every single level, and the digital space is being turned into a weapon to stifle dissent. And frankly, I consider it was extremely embarrassing for me to watch when the delegation turned around to Pakistan and said, "Okay, you've not answered any of our questions, and we don't understand why. So we're requesting that you now submit the new responses in written form." So the committee is waiting on Pakistan to submit the responses in written form and go into the detail of the exact incidents that they brought up of the violations that happened in terms of the internet. Now we can see when they brought up the election, when they brought up the Baloch Raji Muchi, when they brought up Dr. Mahram Baloch being prevented from going to New York, when they brought up when they brought up Samideen Baloch being prevented from going to Geneva. All of you see the relevance of social media and digital rights and internet and all of these things because, for example, Dr. Mahram Baloch, she live recorded her passport being taken away. She recorded the police assault, and then her phone was snatched, which contained the evidence of this happening, right? So we're seeing how the very clear attack on spaces, on, things that have evidence, things that, tools for documentation, they're being taken away through the violation of other rights. So it's a huge web, it's a huge khichdi of sorts, and a very intentional khichdi that the government has made and manufactured in order to one, portray a certain image on the international level that, we abide by all of these things, we do all of these things, we have all of these bodies, we're doing everything in a very efficient way, we respect human rights, etc., and yet they were unable to answer a single specific question for the number incidents and massive human rights violations that have been taken place and that have been documented and submitted to the international body.
It remains to be seen what the Pakistani state and delegation now, in response to very specific questions raised, what is it that they end up submitting? And I think this is a critical sort of connection that Alifiyah has drawn here, that digital rights, when we talk about them, it's not in some vacuum. They are connected to civil and political rights. And because of the heavy mainstream capture of sorts, now you have only social media. So everybody was viewing the committee sessions online. Everybody was responding in real time. And as Alifiyah mentioned, the human rights violations that we see, whether it's about peaceful protests or other connected rights, that discourse is primarily taking place online because there is no other venue. And what happens in different provinces and how you hear about them on what the events is also primarily through social media and online connectivity. And so that is the connection to be drawn and why it is important to preserve the digital space as well and the capture that has extended to it. This is all we have on the DigiPod today. Thank you for joining us.